somewhere between the coastal town of Puttalam and the village of Sirambiadia, in a country whose population geneticists have spent the last 2 decades mapping in extraordinary detail, lives a community small enough to count by hand at a single village gathering. Sri Lanka's Kaffirs, descendants of Africans brought to the island by Portuguese colonists 5 centuries ago, numbered in the low thousands as recently as 2005. Today, most estimates place the population at around 1,000 people, scattered mainly across Puttalam, Trincomalee, Batticaloa and Colombo. This is the smallest, most fragile community this channel has ever covered, and unlike almost every other population profiled here, this isn't just a story about a history science hasn't studied yet. It's a story about a window that may be closing before anyone gets the chance. The historical outline is well established, even if the details remain thin. Beginning in the 16th century, Portuguese colonists brought enslaved and conscripted Bantu Africans, transported primarily through Mozambique and Goa to Sri Lanka to serve as soldiers and laborers, deployed at times specifically to fight against Sinhala kings, resisting Portuguese expansion. When the Dutch and later the British took control of the island, they continued the practice, bringing additional Africans as auxiliary troops and domestic labor. The name Kaffir itself traces back through Portuguese to the Arabic word Kaffir, originally a term used broadly by Arab traders to describe non-Muslim African peoples, later adopted by European colonial powers across the Indian Ocean world as a catch-all label with almost no regard for the specific ethnic or linguistic diversity of the people it was applied to. After the British formally abolished the slave trade in 1845, many African-descended people on the island returned to their countries of origin. The ones who stayed settled into small, tight-knit communities, developing a distinct Portuguese-based Creole language and a musical tradition called Kaffrinha, a lively fusion of African rhythm and Portuguese melody that remains, to this day, the community's most visible cultural signature. Sri Lanka, as a country, has not been genetically overlooked in general. Population geneticists have spent the past 2 decades running detailed studies of the island's major ethnic communities, autosomal marker surveys, Y chromosome analyses, mitochondrial DNA sequencing, and, as recently as 2021, a comprehensive X-chromosomal short tandem repeat study covering all 4 major recognized ethnic groups on the island. A 2025 whole genome study went further still, mapping the Sinhalese population's genetic relationship to South Indian groups and Sri Lanka's own indigenous Adivasi communities in fine detail. This is not a country where population genetics infrastructure is missing. If anything, Sri Lanka has one of the more actively studied population genetics landscapes in South Asia. Given that level of research activity, you'd reasonably expect the Kaffirs, a distinctly named, historically documented, culturally recognized ethnic community, to have shown up somewhere in that body of work by now, even as a small supplementary sample alongside the larger studies. Before we explain why that expectation doesn't hold, it's worth sitting with how unusual this particular gap actually is. This isn't a case like Afro-Iraq, where decades of war and instability plausibly explain why specialized research never happened. Sri Lanka has functioning universities, active genetics labs, and a track record of publishing detailed ethnic population studies on a regular basis. The infrastructure that would be needed to study the Kaffirs specifically already exists and is already being used repeatedly on every other named ethnic group on the island. A review of the major Sri Lankan population genetics literature, the 2021 XSTR study covering Sinhalese, Sri Lankan Tamils, Indian Tamils, and Moors, the mitochondrial DNA work covering the island's 5 major ethnic groups plus the Veda, the 2025 whole genome sequencing project, turns up no dedicated sample, no subgroup analysis, no passing genetic reference to the Kaffir community at all. Every other named ethnic group on the island, including populations of comparable or smaller size like the Veda, has been sequenced, sampled, and written into the genetic record. The Kaffirs, despite having their own recognized name, language, and cultural institutions, simply aren't in it. Here's a question worth sitting with before we get to the likely explanation. How does a population get left out of research that has methodically covered every other ethnic group in the same small country? The most probable answer isn't hostility or deliberate exclusion, it's scale intersecting with logistics. A population of roughly 1,000 people, concentrated in a handful of small village clusters, sits below the practical sampling threshold. Most population genetics studies are designed around, which typically aim for dozens or hundreds of participants per group to produce statistically meaningful results. Recruiting enough Kaffir participants to build a scientifically robust sample would require a level of targeted, community-specific fieldwork that broader national surveys, built to compare Sinhalese, Tamil, and Moor populations against each other, were never designed to include. The community's small size, in other words, isn't just a demographic fact. It's the specific reason the population keeps falling through the gaps of research built at a different scale entirely. If a gap like that, a community so small it doesn't register on the instruments built to find it, makes you want to know what other tiny, overlooked populations are sitting just below the threshold researchers usually work at. That's precisely the kind of story this channel keeps chasing, so go ahead and subscribe now, because we're about to look at another population that's been hiding in exactly this kind of statistical blind spot. And if you know of a small community anywhere in the world whose population has dropped low enough that its history might disappear before anyone properly documents it, tell us in the comments, because that urgency is exactly what makes a population worth covering here before it's too late. This is where the Kaffir case becomes genuinely different from every other science hasn't looked yet story this channel has told. For the Afro-Turks, for Jerusalem's African Quarter, for the Zanj of Basra, the population itself is stable or growing, meaning the scientific gap, while real, isn't racing against a clock. The Kaffirs are in a different position entirely. A population once counted in the low thousands has fallen to roughly a tenth of that within a single generation, driven by intermarriage, migration, and the same economic pressures pulling young people out of small rural communities worldwide. The Kaffrinha musical tradition, the community's most visible cultural marker, survives today largely because of deliberate revival efforts and public performances aimed at keeping it alive for outside audiences, an encouraging sign of cultural resilience, but also a quiet indicator of how much work is now required just to keep the tradition visible at all. Every year this population continues shrinking is a year closer to a point where even a well-funded, well-designed genetic study would struggle to find enough participants to run one. There's a comparative point worth making here too, because it sharpens exactly how unusual this specific gap is. The Vedda, Sri Lanka's indigenous population, and by some estimates an even smaller community than the Kaffirs in terms of individuals who maintain traditional practices, have been the subject of repeated, dedicated genetic study precisely because of their perceived significance to questions about the island's deep human history, its relationship to South Indian populations, and the broader peopling of South Asia. The Vedda's small size didn't exclude them from research. If anything, it made them a priority, because their genome was seen as answering a specific scientific question researchers already cared about. The Kaffirs, by contrast, don't fit into that same kind of pre-existing research agenda. Their story sits outside the two dominant narratives that usually attract funding in South Asian population genetics, the deep prehistoric peopling of the subcontinent on one hand, and the well-documented South Asian diaspora populations more commonly studied elsewhere, like the Siddhis of India, on the other. A 500-year-old, small, Portuguese-era African community doesn't map neatly onto either of those funding narratives, and that mismatch, more than simple population size alone, may be the real reason no one has built a study around them yet. For the Kaffirs who remain today, primarily in Puttalam Sirambiadia village and smaller clusters in Trincomalee, Batticaloa, and Colombo, community identity persists through exactly the channels you'd expect from a population this small. Extended family networks, church congregations rooted in the community's historical Catholic conversion under Portuguese rule, and cultural performance, Kaffrinha dance troupes that now travel to festivals and cultural showcases specifically to keep the tradition in public view. Local researchers and cultural documentarians, working in the absence of genetic data, have relied on oral history, linguistic preservation of the community's Portuguese Creole, and ethnographic fieldwork to keep the historical record from disappearing entirely, a parallel effort running alongside, rather than informed by, the genetic research that has never arrived. What the Kaffir case adds to everything this series has covered is a genuinely different kind of urgency. Most of the populations profiled here have historical or genetic questions that remain open indefinitely, available to be answered whenever researchers eventually get around to them. This one has a shrinking deadline attached. The Kaffirs are not vanishing from the historical record. Their name, language, and music have been documented well enough to survive in the cultural memory of Sri Lanka, regardless of what genetics ever confirms. But the population itself, the actual living community whose DNA could eventually answer the deeper questions about their African origins that history alone cannot, is thinning out year by year, in real time, while the research infrastructure capable of studying them properly continues to look everywhere except at them. If there is a single lesson this specific case leaves behind, it may be the simplest and most urgent one this channel has offered yet. History can wait for science indefinitely, but populations cannot. And somewhere in the gap between those two timelines, a 500-year-old story is running out of people left to tell it firsthand.